She would scoop me out the back door on summer mornings right after breakfast. I would run free and play until lunchtime, and then after lunchtime, my mother would send me out again until dinner time. Even after dinner time, out I would go one more time until darkness fell and the mosquitoes got too bad. If you didn't know better, you might think my mom didn't like me very much. But actually, it was just the opposite. My mother loved me by giving me the sun and sky and freedom. Now, despite all this freedom, every once in a while my mom would need me for something in the middle of the day, or sometimes her motherly ESP would kick in and she would sense that I might be in some kind of danger, or more likely in some kind of mischief. In those occasions, my mother would go to the back door, step outside onto the back porch, and call, "Jimmy, come home. Jimmy, come home." I can remember hearing her voice in the woods. I can remember hearing her voice in the neighbor's yard, in the neighbor's house, on the dirt road to the gravel pit. Somehow, above all the other noises of those summer days, I was attuned to my mother's voice. I heard her voice. I have to go, I would tell my friends. My mom is calling me. Hearing is something that we train at, often unconsciously. We can do the same thing with not hearing. I've been reading about that a lot lately because despite my great love affair with this crazy city, there are times when it is just too noisy. I feel that most keenly when I am home, the one place where I expect some peace and quiet. But we live on Amsterdam Avenue between St. Luke's Hospital, a fire station, and a police department. Marcos got me some noise-canceling headphones, which I adore. But recently, I've been thinking about more natural solutions. Maybe I could learn not to be bothered by the noise. If hearing is something that we learn, then maybe I, James Campbell, could learn not to hear certain things. Today's lesson from the First Testament is all about hearing. More specifically, it is about hearing God, a poignant topic for those of us bold enough or foolish enough to claim in the 21st century that God is still speaking. Hannah couldn't have any children. And so she prayed to the Lord, promising that if God would give her a child, she would give that child back to God's service. God answered her prayer, and she gave birth to a boy named Samuel, which means God has heard. When the child was old enough, she took him to live in the temple of the Lord in Jerusalem with an old blind man named Eli, who was the high priest. Eli took this little boy under his wing, perhaps hoping to make up for the mess he had made of his own family. You see, Eli had two sons already, adults, one named Hophni, one named Phinehas, both of them rotten to the core. They were priests too, but they abused their position as priests to take advantage of women and to steal from the sacrifices of the people. They were the lowest of the low, those two. Old Eli slept in one room, but the boy Samuel slept in another room, the very room where the Ark of the Covenant was kept. One night, Samuel was awakened by a voice calling his name. Thinking it was Eli, he ran to the old man's room and asked Samuel got on his mat and began to drift off again, the voice came again, and so he got up and ran back to Eli. "I didn't call you, kid. Go back to bed." When this happened for the third time, Eli, the high priest who lived in the temple, finally understood that maybe the Lord was calling. "Next time it happens," said Eli, "ask the Lord what the Lord wants." Well, sure enough, it did happen again, and this time the boy Samuel was rehearsed in his reply, and he said, "Speak, Lord, for your servant is listening." And what the Lord said was something that Samuel didn't really want to hear, he didn't want to say, he didn't want to tell Eli. Because the word of the Lord was a word of judgment against Eli and his sons and his whole house, the whole family line. God had seen how his sons had abused the weak, the poor, the vulnerable, and God said, "They're finished. No more." So what do you think Samuel actually heard? Was it a real voice? Was it a dream? Was it a 12-year-old's imagination? Was it a feeling that he had? And how did he know? How do we know ever that the voices we hear are God's voice and not just our own imagination? The naysayers out there, and there are lots of them, an increasing number of them, think that when we pray, when we talk to God, we are actually just talking to ourselves. And in some way, that's true. To pray is, in part, to talk to one's self. But that talking to ourselves is a kind of training that enables us to hear what God has to say. Prayer, talking to yourself, is a kind of training to hear what God has to say. And here's what I mean by that. Stanford University professor Tanya Luhrmann spent 10 years researching this subject, and her book is called How Evangelicals Hear the Voice of God. Her conclusion, which applies not just to evangelicals, but to any of us who have ever prayed, is that in learning to pray, in talking to ourselves, we are learning to use our minds differently than we do in the rest of our everyday lives. Professor Luhrmann says, praying is like training your muscles. In teaching people to pray, the church encourages us to tune into sounds, images, feelings that are louder or different or more intense or not very familiar than all the rest of the stimuli in our daily life, and to interpret those feelings, nudges, noises as the external voice of God. Now, Professor Luhrmann's description is not unlike what I experienced as a little boy in Logansport, Indiana. You see, in addition to hearing my mom's voice carried along a warm summer breeze, I was actually attuned to her in other ways. I sometimes sensed that my mother needed me. I sensed that she was calling me. I sensed that it was time to go home, and it was something far more subtle than her actual voice. In Jewish theology, God is rarely thought of as speaking in an obvious way. The rabbis recognize that there are those dramatic moments in the history of Israel when people literally heard the voice of God. Samuel's story is one of those. The baptism of Jesus last week is another one of those. But, they say, that is not how God speaks most of the time. Usually it is far more subtle, the rabbis say. They refer to the voice of God as the bat kol, a Hebrew phrase that simply means the daughter of a voice. A voice that is strangely familiar, a voice that is very quiet. And the rabbis say the bat kol happens in the midst of everyday life, amongst all the other noises of your days. The Jewish Encyclopedia describes it like this. Bat kol means the reverberation or hum caused by the motion of all things, which fills the whole world, and which accompanies every human voice, every other sound in the universe. It is the voice you hear behind your back, the rabbis say. Which makes me wonder if a better phrase for the United Church of Christ might be, God is still whispering. God is still reverberating. This weekend we remember another voice. The thundering voice of a prophet, of Martin Luther King Jr. Like Samuel, Dr. King called out the wickedness in high places. He called leaders into account for the way the most vulnerable were mistreated. And because he did all of those things, we have made King larger than life. But before King was ever that towering figure and that thundering, eloquent voice, he was a little boy like Samuel, growing up in a parsonage, who played jokes and practiced the piano and made friends without considering race. But life taught him that race mattered. His experiences and his pain and his faith nudged him to want to do something about it. In a 2006 book, his sister, Christine King Ferris, writes about her little brother who became a prophet. And she says that as he grew, he became more and more and more attuned to the bat kol, the daughter of a voice. It happened to him very slowly, she writes. Which makes me think that we never need to wait for anything more dramatic than that to actually believe that God is still speaking. If you have ever once longed for a better world, then the bat kol is whispering. If you have ever dreamed of racial and gender harmony and justice for the poor, then the daughter of a voice, the voice behind your back, is reverberating. And all that remains after that is to do what it says. That's all that remains. Thanks be to God.